Welcome to the Minds of Murderers podcast, which is found at panicamongus.com, youtube.com/Murderpedia, Overcast, and wherever else podcasts can be found. This collaborative project between myself, Reese, and Jess is a regular podcast focusing on true crime and specifically serial killers. Our main aim is to offer something clinical, factual, and intriguing, to deliver all the facts and try to answer the question of why people carry out the most heinous acts on their fellow human. This episode will focus on Ted Bundy, an infamous American serial killer that preyed upon women up and down the US and broke the mold for what many expected of a serial killer at the time. Join us as we aim to get inside the minds of murderers. We serial killers are your sons, we are your husbands, we are everywhere, and there will be more of your children dead tomorrow. A quote from Ted Bundy. In Burlington, Vermont, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, Eleanor Louise Cowell, who went by Louise, gave birth to a baby boy, Theodore Robert Cowell, who would later go by Ted Bundy. At the time of his birth, on November 4th, 1946, his biological father was unknown. Louise put the name Lloyd Marshall on the birth certificate, but later asserted that she had been seduced by war veteran Jack Worthington. This was never corroborated, and rumours spread that her alcoholic, abusive father Samuel Cowell was baby Ted's real father. Ted was raised to believe that his maternal grandparents were his parents, while Louise was his sister. They came to this arrangement to avoid the social stigma of Louise having a child out of wedlock. The family stayed around the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area for Ted's early years. Once, while his aunt was napping on the couch, she awoke to find 3-year-old Ted giggling madly. He had placed knives all around her while she slept. At this time, his behaviour was viewed as commonplace. It's not uncommon for children to test limits as they begin to learn right from wrong, so this early incident didn't set off any alarm bells. But looking back, it's pretty telling. In 1950, to escape her abusive father, Louise took little Ted to Tacoma, Washington to live with relatives. Their surnames were temporarily changed to Nelson, possibly to make it more difficult for her father to find them. Once the pair were settled, they began to attend service at Tacoma's First Methodist Church. Here she met Johnny Culliper Bundy, and the two quickly married in May 1951. Johnny was a good man and adopted Ted, giving him the surname Bundy. He attempted to bond with the boy over ordinary father-son activities, but Ted was emotionally detached. Young Ted was beginning to exhibit some behaviours that were making his parents uneasy. As a child, he was taken to visit with a psychologist who said about Ted, "Something inhabited his mind with the subtlety of a cat." The sessions with the doctor did not continue. Ted became increasingly more shy and introverted as he progressed through school. Outwardly, he would later claim that he could maintain a facade of social activity, but he didn't truly understand how and why people got along. "I didn't know what made things tick. I didn't know what made people want to be friends. I didn't know what made people attractive to one another. I didn't know what underlay social interactions," Ted Bundy said of his teen years. Once in high school, Ted came out of his shell. He was active in the local Methodist church, even being vice president of the Methodist Youth Fellowship. He was also involved in the local boys' school troop. He was somewhat popular and well liked amongst his peers, and he did relatively well in school. But Ted was hiding his true self. In secret, he was fascinated with crime and detective novels and magazines. He would find ones that featured sexual violence and showed pictures of dead bodies. He became enthralled by graphic pornography and violence. He called this evolving part of himself the entity. By the time he graduated in 1965 from Woodrow Wilson High School, he was a compulsive liar, a shoplifter, and on the path to becoming a criminal. He was arrested twice as a minor for stealing ski equipment and forging lift tickets, but these charges were later expunged. Before we move on from his formative years, I would like to make a quick note. Bundy did not meet the most common criteria for becoming a serial killer. He did not wear the bed, he did not torture or mutilate animals, he did not start fires, nor were there any serious head injuries. However, he was a suspect in the rape and murder of an 8-year-old girl, Anne Marie Burr, when he was 16, but it was never concretely linked back to him. By all accounts, Ted should have been an active and thriving member of society, And on the surface he appeared to be, but deep down, he wasn't. Bundy was awarded a full scholarship to the University of Puget and attended in the fall of 1965. He majored in psychology and took classes in Oriental studies. He didn't stay around for long, however, only making it through 2 semesters before transferring to Seattle's University of Washington. While attending school, he continued to put forth the image of the all-American boy. He worked as a bagger and shelf stocker at a Safeway grocery store. He also started volunteering for night shifts at Seattle's Suicide Hotline, which served the greater Seattle metropolitan area and suburban areas. It was theorized after his arrest that he took this job so he could hear people in pain, so he could experience their pain. It was an erotic experience for him. While he may have been aroused on the inside, he put on his mask of humanity for his partner, Anne Rule. The same woman who would go on to become an accomplished true crime author. Anne had this to say about Bundy: "Ted was so wonderful on the phone. He sounded caring, he was interested in people. Many times we saved lives," which seems very ironic to me now. While at the University of Washington, Ted Bundy met the only woman he may have ever truly loved, Stephanie Brooks. Not her real name. She was said to be the reason Bundy would go on to murder beautiful girls with brown hair parted down the middle, who wore pants or slacks. They were a couple for 1 year, before Stephanie graduated and broke it off with Bundy. She described him as not husband material, immature, and lacking ambition. This breakup was hard on Bundy, and he decided to go off and find himself. He travelled back to his hometown in Vermont and visited the county clerk. This is when he discovered that his sister was really his mother, and his parents were actually his grandparents. This discovery changed something in Bundy. He became more dominant and focused. It triggered something inside of him, a drive to succeed. In 1968, Bundy took an interest in politics. He managed the Seattle office at Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign and attended the '68 Republican Convention in Miami, Florida. After his brief stint away from school, he re-enrolled and worked diligently to become an honor student. He was very well liked by his classmates and professors. He was described as brilliant and charismatic. To overcome his heartbreak from Stephanie, he began dating Elizabeth Klopfer, a divorce secretary who had a young daughter. They both loved him dearly, and he remained in their lives for 6 years. It is not documented as to why they parted ways. Bundy graduated from the University of Washington in 1972 with a degree in psychology. It was later speculated that he chose this as his major so he could learn how people worked, how they think, and why they do what they do. After graduation, he jumped back into political work. Bundy was an aspiring official, hoping to be governor of Washington one day. He started work for the Republican Party, which included a close relationship with Governor Daniel J. Evans. Bundy would follow the Democratic rival around. He'd weasel himself into the inner circle by pretending to be an eager university student and take notes about his speeches and then report back to Evans. This guise was uncovered and resulted in scandal. Bundy recovered from the scandal, however, and reconnected with ex-girlfriend Stephanie. They met while he was attending a business trip to California in 1973. She was impressed with his new look and his new attitude. He seemed like a serious and dedicated professional. By this point, he had even been accepted into law school at the University of Utah. They were together for approximately 1 year before Ted proposed. She said yes, and he dumped her 2 weeks later by ghosting her. She did ultimately reach him by phone and ask him what had happened. All he had to say to her was, "Stephanie, I have no idea what you mean." And he never spoke to her again. He later said, "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her," which highlights the lingering feelings of pain he had from their relationship, and that Bundy saw this as a power move to prove to himself that he was the dominant player in the relationship. This manipulative and controlling attitude is ultimately what led him down the road of a serial killer. Ted Bundy's first victim is not very clear. It could have been when he was a teenager and potentially murdered 8-year-old Anne Marie Burr, or it could have been the 1973 murder of Kathy Devine. He was not convicted of either murder, and he was actually dropped as a suspect of Kathy Devine's murder when DNA cleared him in 2002. We can confirm, however, with 100% accuracy that on the night of January the 4th, 1974, he entered the basement bedroom of 18-year-old Karen Sparks. Karen was a dancer and student at the University of Washington. While she slept, he bludgeoned her with a metal rod that he took from her bed frame. He sexually assaulted her with a speculum and forced the metal rod into her vagina. She was discovered the next morning by her roommate, saturated in blood. She was still alive though. She may have gone on to survive, but she had suffered permanent brain damage and passed away from her injuries. Karen is the only victim of Bundy's that he did not take elsewhere to assault. Bundy did not take much time off to cool down between attacks, which is uncommon as most repeat killers start off relatively slowly to begin with and become more frantic and erratic as time goes on. On February the 1st, 1974, he broke into the room of Linda Ann Healy, a ski forecaster who gave reports on skiing conditions. He knocked her out, dressed her in jeans and a t-shirt, wrapped her body in a sheet, and simply walked out of her house. The only thing he left behind was a pool of blood on the bed. As we continue through our story, I want you to keep in mind that many of these kidnappings take place near construction sites at night. It was thought that he did this so the small noises could be explained away. Also, after his first couple of attacks, he crafted his own bludgeoning instruments. He added handles to a crowbar, a pipe, and a crescent wrench. In March of the same year, he kidnapped and murdered Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student from Evergreen State College. In April of that year, he kidnapped and murdered Susan Rancourt. She was a student that disappeared from the Central Washington State campus in Ellisburg, Washington. This was the first time Bundy was identified as being suspicious. He was witnessed by multiple students with his arm in a cast, asking for help carrying books to his car, a bright yellow VW Bug. This MO and this car would go on to be synonymous with Bundy's killings. At this point, Bundy was killing a woman a month. In May, he picked up Kathy Parks, who was last seen on the Oregon State University campus in Corvallis, Oregon. In June, he picked up Brenda Ball from the Flame Tavern in Burien, Oregon. 10 days later, he picked up Georgian Hawkins, a student from the University of Washington and sister in the Kappa Alpha Theta sorority. Hawkins had been walking down an alley in the early morning from her boyfriend's dorm to her own sorority house when she came across Bundy. He was wearing a leg cast and struggling with a briefcase. It was assumed that he asked her for help to get into his car. Georgine was reportedly his first experimentation with necrophilia. Ted Bundy relied on one thing: to be invisible to everyone except yourself. He kept his looks generic. He was moderately handsome, he might change his facial hair or hairstyle, but nothing outrageous, and he almost always wore a turtleneck to cover a distinguishable mole on his neck. He became very skilled at presenting a good persona to put women at ease, but his intent was anything but good. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Bundy was not simply having his way with these ladies and dumping them unceremoniously. He would take his time tending his own little graveyard on Taylor Mountain in Washington. He would put makeup on the women and wash their hair. Then he would have sex with the bodies. He would do this until the body became so putrefied that it was no longer possible. His two final murders in Washington were near Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah, Washington. July 14, 1974, 8 witnesses report a man with his arm in a sling asking for help unloading a sailboat. The man was telling people his name was Ted. Bundy asked 4 women for help before one finally agreed to go with him back to his car. Janice Ott agreed to help and was never seen again. A few hours later, Denise Naslund succumbed to the same fate. Before he left Washington State to move to Utah, Bundy worked at the Washington State Department of Emergency Services. This department was heavily involved in the search for the missing women in the area. Bundy could have potentially had direct contact with his victims' families. While he was helping families search, detectives were looking into the case as well. They were gathering witness statements and had compiled enough information to put together a composite sketch, which was plastered all over the Seattle area. The sketch was so similar to Bundy that an ex-girlfriend, a previous psychology professor, and Anne Rule all called in to report him as a suspect. Unfortunately, the police were receiving upwards of 200 calls a day, so no attention was paid to the young, clean-cut Bundy. Pieces of Bundy's skull graveyard were discovered by hikers the next year. They were identified as skulls and jawbones belonging to Healy, Rancourt, Parks and Ball on Taylor Mountain. No remains of Donna Manson were ever discovered. Towards the end of 1974, Bundy left the Washington area and moved to Utah so he could attend law school at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Once in Utah, he made a meager attempt at writing his life. He was baptized into the Mormon faith. However, he was still having murderous urges and failed to keep his life on the straight and narrow. By fall 1974, Bundy had started his first semester at law school. By that October, he had kidnapped and murdered Nancy Wilcox from Holiday, Utah. She was last seen getting into his signature yellow VW Bug. Halloween night, October 31st, 1974, 17-year-old Laura Aim went missing after she left a party in Leah, Utah. Her body was found a month later, naked, beaten and strangled near the river in American Fork Canyon. In November of that year, in Murray, Utah, Carol DeRonch becomes one of the only women to narrowly escape Bundy's clutches. Bundy approached the young DeRonch while she was shopping at the Fashion Place Mall and said his name was Officer Roseland. He told her that her car had been hit and broken into and that she needed to come with him. She agreed to go with him and immediately followed him out to his car, the yellow VW Bug. She got in but declined to buckle her seatbelt. As they drove, she realised that he was driving in the opposite direction of the police station and became suspicious. He pulled over to the side of the road when she began to ask questions, and he attempted to get a pair of handcuffs on her. He only succeeded in getting both loops around one wrist before she pried her way out of the car. Bundy tumbled out after her and tried to hit her with his crowbar, but she stopped the instrument before it could come down on her head. With a swift kick to the testicles, she ran away as fast as she could. An hour after his botched kidnapping and murder attempt of DeRonch, Bundy found himself at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, Utah. The drama club was putting on a play and the auditorium was packed. Bundy skulked around the building and managed to talk to the drama teacher and a student, whom he asked to accompany him to the parking lot. Both women declined. The teacher later told investigators that this man was dishevelled and breathing heavily. Another witness saw him lurking around the outside of the auditorium. At intermission, 17-year-old Deborah Debbie Kent left the auditorium to pick up her little brother. She was never seen again. When her disappearance was later investigated, a small key was found, which turned out to be the key to the handcuffs on DeRonch's wrists. Bundy was usually very meticulous about his crime scenes, making sure to never leave any trace evidence. But now, he was starting to lose his edge, to get sloppy. He was becoming more frantic and erratic. It was clear his mental state was deteriorating. In January 1975, while still attending law school, Bundy relocated his crimes to nearby Colorado. He kidnapped and murdered Karen Campbell, who was on vacation with her fiancé and his children. She vanished from the short distance between her room and the elevator. Her body wasn't found until February 17th. Vail ski instructor Julie Cunningham disappeared after a man using crutches approached her and asked for help carrying his ski boots to his car. Once at his car, he bludgeoned her with a crowbar, handcuffed her and strangled her. Bundy continued to murder monthly. April, he murdered Denise Oliverson. May, he murdered Lynette Culver, who was only a junior in high school at the time. June, he murdered Susan Curtis. This one, strangely, he did not confess to until moments before his death. The bodies of Cunningham, Culver, Curtis and Oliverson were never found. As his body count grew, Bundy's name was coming up again and again on the list of suspects. his name was finally added to the to-be-investigated list. The officer inspected Bundy's car and found a ski mask, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, an ice pick, and other burglary tools. His front passenger seat was also missing. He had turned his VW Beetle into a mobile murder machine. When the officer asked about the items, Bundy told him that he used the mask for skiing and he had found the handcuffs while dumpster diving. He was taken into custody and his car was impounded. Detective Jerry Thompson, who was working the case of the missing and murdered women, found out about Bundy's arrest. He made the connection between his yellow Beetle and the attempted kidnapping of DeRonch. A search warrant was issued for detectives to search Bundy's apartment. His apartment was meticulously clean. They found a couple of brochures during their search, one being a brochure talking about different ski resorts in Colorado. Next to the Wildwood Inn, there was a small check mark. This was the resort where Karen Campbell disappeared. The second was a program for the school play he attended. They found no evidence of Bundy's involvement in any criminal activity. What they had was simply circumstantial evidence. Bundy later taunted the police by saying that if they had really searched his utility room, they would have found a large stack of Polaroids. These Polaroids were never produced, so their existence could be fabricated. Bundy was placed in a lineup and instantly identified by DeRonch and the witnesses from the high school play. Though they lacked physical evidence, there was an abundance of circumstantial evidence which relied heavily on eyewitness testimony. After a trial that lasted 1 week, Bundy was convicted of DeRonch's kidnapping on March 1, 1976. He was sentenced to 15 years in Utah State Prison. When word of his conviction made its way back to the crisis team Bundy had worked with in Washington, they were appalled. They didn't believe a single word of it and raised a considerable amount to help him with legal fees. The following year, in 1977, Bundy was extradited to Colorado to face murder charges for the death of Carolyn Campbell. While in Colorado, Bundy made the decision to act as his own lawyer. He requested time in the law library so he could prepare for his trial, which he was granted. When no one was looking, he jumped out from an unlocked window. Unfortunately, the law library was on the second floor. As he hit the ground, he sprained his ankle, but overall was unharmed. He took a casual stroll through town, making his way towards the Aspen Mountains. He was on the lam for 6 days. In this time, he had stolen a car, another VW Beetle in fact, and was pulled over for erratic driving. The officer recognised Bundy, and he was arrested without incident. Once back in the Glenwood Springs jail, he started to work on another escape plan. He was growing quite the fan base at this time, and was able to collect $500 from a fan and concealed a hacksaw blade. He used the blade to grind down the welds on a small metal plate in the ceiling. Once the plate was loosened, the hole was approximately 1 square foot. For Bundy to fit through the small opening, he lost 35 pounds in weight. He went on trial runs at night and would explore the narrow space above the ceiling. Another inmate heard Bundy moving around in the ceiling at night and reported it to the guards. They did not believe him and it was not investigated. The Campbell murder trial was set to start on January 9, 1978, and Bundy was going to be moved to Colorado Springs, Colorado. He knew that he needed to enact his escape plan before he was transferred. On the night of December 30th, 1977, Bundy put his plan into action. He dressed warmly, stuffed his bed with books and papers to make it appear like he was sleeping, and crawled through his escape hatch. He crawled through the space until he reached the jailer's apartment. He knew the jailer wouldn't be there because of the holiday season. He dropped down into the linen closet, stole some clothes from the man, and simply walked out the front door. 17 hours later, he was in Chicago. From Chicago, he took a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he took a break to watch his alma mater team, the Washington Huskies, go head-to-head against Michigan in the Rose Bowl. His team won, and he was in a good mood. From there, he made his way gradually to Tallahassee, Florida. He wanted to become legitimate. He rented a room in a boarding house under the name Chris Hagen, but he sometimes went by Rolf Miller. He grew a moustache and would draw a mole on his left cheek when he went out. He applied for a job at a construction site, but left when they asked for ID. During his first week in Tallahassee, Bundy would randomly pop into the larger lectures at Florida State University and walk around campus. He did commit some petty crimes to earn some cash, like shoplifting, purse snatching, stealing credit cards and auto theft. He also stole the identity of Florida State University student Kenneth Misner. After 1 week, Bundy grew tired of this new life. He missed the thrill of murder and decided to go out for a walk. On the night of January the 15th, 1978, Bundy went to the Chi Omega sorority house on the Florida State University campus. He walked in through a rear door that had a broken lock. First, he came upon Lisa Levy, a 20-year-old woman. She was found without a pulse. Her right nipple had almost been completely bitten off. Her left collarbone was broken, she was strangled, and a large bottle of hairspray had been shoved up her vagina. Bundy had also left a large bite mark on her left buttock. Because of this bite mark, the press dubbed the unknown killer the Love Bite Killer, until it was discovered to be Bundy. Next was Margaret Bowman, a 21-year-old woman. A nylon stocking had been pulled around her neck so tightly that it had begun to tear, and she had been beaten so severely over the head that her bone was splintered and her brain was exposed. He bludgeoned 2 other girls in the house, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. Kathy was found sitting upright in her bed with her head in her hands. Blood was gushing from the wounds. She had lacerations and puncture marks on her face, broken teeth, a broken jaw in 3 places, and whiplash injuries to her neck. She would survive, but her teeth were permanently loosened, and she had to have a pin placed in her jaw. Karen was discovered stumbling down the hallway with broken teeth, a broken jaw, skull fractures, cuts, and crushed fingers. She would also survive. All of these attacks occurred in less than 30 minutes. A witness saw a man leaving the house hurriedly as she was returning home from a late-night date. She said he had a log wrapped in cloth, which turned out to be the instrument used to bludgeon the women. After the Chi Omega assaults and murders, Bundy went a few blocks away and broke into the home of Florida State University student Cheryl Thomas. Cheryl lived in a basement apartment and was found in her bed whimpering and writhing in pain. She was already beginning to bruise moments after the attack. She was swollen and had severe head wounds. Her skull was fractured in 5 places, which had caused permanent hearing loss in her left ear. Her left shoulder had been dislocated, her jaw broken, a cranial nerve had been affected, and she would suffer from dizziness for the rest of her life. She had been a promising dancer before the attack, but it had all been taken away from her in a few seconds. Her roommates were alerted when they heard crying and thumping sounds. Bundy didn't make a single noise during the attack and managed to get away. On February the 9th, 1978, Bundy would abduct his final victim, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. He raped the young girl and then murdered her and threw her body under a pig shed. A massive search was undertaken. 8 weeks later, they finally found her bare bones in the pig pen. A few days after his final murder, he stole another VW Bug and left Tallahassee for good. He headed west across the Florida Panhandle. On the 15th of February, at 1 a.m, he was stopped by Officer David Lee. The vehicle had been reported stolen. When Officer Lee instructed Bundy to get out of the car, he had his legs kicked out from under him and Bundy ran. Lee fired a warning shot and followed in pursuit. Lee tackled him and Bundy pretended to be shot. He was ultimately restrained and arrested. Upon the search of his car, he found 3 sets of ID from Florida State University co-eds. Bundy told Officer Lee, "I wish you had killed me." In the summer of 1979, Ted Bundy was put on trial for the Chi Omega murders. Honourable Judge Edward D. Cowart was presiding. Bundy's murder trial will be the first one of its kind to be televised to a national audience. Bundy had been assigned a team of competent lawyers, but chose to represent himself. One of the lawyers assigned to him said Ted was facing murder charges with a possible death sentence, and all that mattered to him apparently was to be in charge. During the trial, there were 2 critical pieces of evidence to prove Bundy's guilt. 1. Witness Nita Neary was the woman who had seen him leaving the sorority house, and 2. The bite marks that he had left on Levy's butt cheek had been an undeniable match to Bundy. There had been plaster moulds made of the bite mark, and compared to Bundy, there was no doubt that it belonged to him. Ted Bundy was convicted in all counts and sentenced to death. This is what Judge Cowart had to say at the sentencing. "It is ordered that you be put to death by a current of electricity. That current will be passed through your body until you are dead. Take care of yourself, young man. I say that to you sincerely. Take care of yourself, please. It is an utter tragedy for this court to see such a total waste of humanity as I have experienced in this courtroom. You're a bright young man, you'd have made a good lawyer, and I would have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself. I don't feel any animosity towards you. I want you to know that. Once again, take care of yourself. The next year, Bundy stood trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach. Once again, Bundy acted as his own lawyer. While questioning a former co-worker, Carol Ann Boone, who he had called as a character witness on his behalf, he married her. There is an obscure law in Florida where you can ask someone to marry you while they're under oath in a court setting, and if they say yes, you are legally married. Bundy was convicted based on eyewitness testimony and fibres found in the car that matched Leach's clothing. After the jury read their verdict, Bundy screamed at the judges to tell the jury that they were wrong. He was again sentenced to death. While on death row, Bundy and his wife conceived a daughter during one of their many conjugal visits. She was born in October 1982. Soon after, Carol moved them both to Washington State, and she had no further contact with Bundy. At this point, Bundy began to talk to the FBI and give interviews. He was attempting to prolong his date of execution or have it commuted to life in prison by appearing useful. FBI profiler Robert K. Resler interviewed Bundy, but he found him uncooperative and manipulative, willing to speak only in the third person and only in hypothetical terms. In his 1992 book, Whoever Fights Monsters, My 20 Years Tracking Serial Killers for the FBI, Resler had this to say about Bundy: "This guy was an animal, and it amazed me that the media seemed unable to understand this." While giving these interviews, it was discovered that Bundy had acquired and stashed 2 hacksaw blades and sawed through the bars on the window of his cell. He had reattached them with soap-based adhesive so he can make his escape later. Bundy struck up a close friendship with young Special Agent William Hagemeyer of the FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit. The BSU had been trying to get an interview with Bundy for years, but he had always refused their more seasoned investigators. They devised a plan to send the young rookie investigator to play on Bundy's ego of wanting to manipulate someone, young and dumb. He would go on to confide many details of his murders to Hagemeyer, many of which were recorded. This opened investigations into many murders and disappearances that had gone cold. In 1984, Bundy reached out to King County homicide detective Bob Keppel. He wanted to offer his murderous insight into the Green River Killer's mind. A team went to Florida to interview him, but said he was of little help. The interviews did, however, help provide an in-depth look into his own mind. In 1988, Bundy contacted Keppel again, this time wanting to talk about the 5 bodies on Taylor Mountain in Washington. They had only suspected 4 up until that point. He confessed in detail to the murder of Georgine Hawkins. The session was recorded. He described how he lured her to his car, clubbed her with a tire iron, and drove away with her body. He then raped and strangled her. He talked about how he kept severed heads in his apartment as trophies until he disposed of them. He blamed various scapegoats as well: his abusive grandfather, his missing biological father, the concealment of his true heritage, alcohol, the media, the police planted evidence, violence on TV, he was brainwashed by TV, mass consumption of sugar retarded his mental growth, and pornography. Keppel said he was shocked by this interview and described Bundy as born to kill. He described the Ithaca crime scene, and it was almost like he was there, like he was seeing everything. He was infatuated with the idea because he spent so much time there. He is just totally consumed with murder all the time, Bob Keppel said. One of Bundy's famous quotes about guilt came from this conversation with Keppel. "Guilt doesn't solve anything, it just hurts you. I guess I'm in the enviable position of not having to deal with guilt." The night before Bundy's execution, he did an on-air interview with Dr. James Dobson on Focus on the Family. It was an evangelical Christian show. They talked about Bundy's pornographic roots to his crimes. He claimed that porn did not drive him to commit murder, but it did help shape and mould his behaviour and methods. Here is what Dr. Dobson said about Bundy. Ted Bundy had something important to say, and he believed the media couldn't be trusted to report it accurately. Therefore, I was invited to bring a camera crew to record his last comments from death row. What is it that Ted Bundy was so anxious to say? He felt he owed it to society to warn of the dangers of hardcore pornography and to explain how it led him to murder so many innocent women and girls. With tears in his eyes, he described the monster that took possession of him when he had been drinking. His craze to kill was always inflamed by violent pornography. On the morning of January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. His last words were, "I'd like to give my love to my family and friends." He was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. Several hundred people gathered outside the prison, and when word came that Bundy was dead, they cheered, sang, danced, and set off fireworks. Bundy was cremated, and his wife scattered his ashes at an undisclosed location in Washington. Many books have been written about Ted Bundy over the years, including Dr. Al Carlisle, who spent one-on-one time with Bundy. He wrote, "I'm Not Guilty, The Development of the Violent Mind, The Case of Ted Bundy." He said that Bundy appeared clean, but he was convinced that this man was a very dangerous psychopath when he interviewed him after his arrest in 1975. He examined how Bundy crossed the line from sexual fantasy to murder and necrophilia. He hypothesized that Bundy had gradually gone through 3 phases. Phase 1, fantasy. The person imagines scenarios for entertainment or self-comfort. In this phase, he is creating stories about himself being the hero. He imagines how he is different from everyone else and begins to develop a separate set of values. 2. Dissociation. The person avoids uncomfortable feelings and memories. To avoid what he interpreted as painful memories or strong emotions, Bundy began to drink copious amounts of alcohol. He wanted to forget his problems. 3. Compartmentalization. The person relegates different ideas and images to specific mental frames and keeps boundaries between them. At this phase, Bundy created a separate good and bad persona. He became the wolf in sheep's clothing. Carlisle claims that Bundy was able to repeatedly kidnap, torture, and murder, but also function as a normal person because of this gradual evolution. I'll leave you with one last quote from Ted Bundy. "Murder is not about lust, and it's not about violence. It's about possession. When you feel the last breath of life coming out of a woman, you look into her eyes. At that point, it's being God."